Hi, I'm Martha Nussbaum, and I'm going to talk now about animals. So people who care about non-human animals have lots to complain about and lots of work to do. To the familiar list of horrors, torture of animals in the meat industry, misery inflicted on puppies by puppy mills, the damages of research using animals, the manifold harms endemic to the confinement of elephants, orcas, whales in zoos and theme parks, we have some further issues that have only become issues in the past decade. Depletion of whale stocks by harpooning, whales killed by ingesting vast quantities of plastic that float around in the sea, the poaching of elephants and rhinos for the international black market, the illicit trafficking of elephants from Africa into US zoos, the devastation of habitat for many large mammals through climate change. New issues arise all the time. The world needs an ethical revolution, a consciousness-raising movement of truly international proportions. And we too, in the humanities, need a revolution, an expansion of our thinking. But bad behavior also needs law, and here we are in the law school. No major crimes against sentient beings have been curbed by ethics alone, without the coercive force of law, although it typically takes an ethical change to goad law into action. And so far, both in the US and in the international community, law has been lagging behind the evolving political consciousness of humanity. Animals still lack standing under both US and international law. All human animals, including those with severe cognitive disabilities, whose interests must be represented by surrogates, are treated as persons and as ends, but all non-human animals are treated as mere things and property. Like the humanities, law must expand its vision, finding ways to make animals legal subjects and not mere objects. To make progress, we need theoretical approaches that are factually sound, grappling with the vast amount we are learning about animals, and that also direct law in a useful fashion. In this talk, I'm going to examine two extremely influential approaches to animal entitlements in philosophy, both of which have implications for law and policy. The first is what I'll call the so like us approach, and the second is what I'll call the least common denominator approach. I'll argue that both are defective, both intellectually and in terms of policy. A version of the capabilities approach, which is an approach to basic entitlements for both humans and now for other animals that I've developed over the years, does far better in directing ethical attention and, I claim, legal progress. So, first, the so like us approach. One prominent and influential approach to animal ethics and law seeks recognition of legal personhood and some autonomy rights for a specific set of animal species on the grounds of their human-like capacities. This approach is associated, above all, with activist Stephen Wise. Wise is one of the most significant pioneers of animal law. His 2000 book, Rattling the Cage, took the field of animal ethics into law schools with striking results. His course on animal law, taught at the Harvard Law School, was one of the first law school courses of its kind. And as the leading figure in the 2016 documentary Unlocking the Cage, shown first at Sundance and now available on YouTube, Wise eloquently describes to the film's many viewers the goals of his non-human rights project. The film follows his legal battles to win limited personhood rights for several chimpanzees being held in captivity. Wise's focus in the book was on just chimpanzees and bonobos, but by now he explicitly includes all 4 species of great apes, as well as elephants, presumably all species of those, and whales and dolphins. His argument rests heavily on claims about the similarity of all these animals to human beings. They are, he says, self-conscious, self-directing. They have a theory of mind. They have culture. They're not, quote, cabined by instinct. They're able to contemplate their own future. In general, he says they're, quote, really, really smart. Centrally, he holds that they are autonomous creatures who, for that reason, should have autonomous lives. Now, Wise is not a philosopher, and he does not explain which of the concepts of autonomy used by philosophers he has in mind, since he also says that he thinks of chimpanzees as at about the cognitive level of a 5-year-old human child. It's not clear that he really should ascribe autonomy to them, if that means, as it typically does, the ability to criticize one's desires in the light of higher order principles, or, as Kant famously held, the ability to free oneself from the influence of culture and authority. Probably he means some less exacting form of self-directedness, such as the ability to choose among alternatives. But of course, many animals, besides his group, exercise choice. In any case, as both book and film repeatedly emphasize, Wise thinks these species of animals are very like humans, and he makes that likeness the basis for his crusade to win them some limited legal rights. It would surely be valuable for him to contemplate the concept of autonomy further, since we do not think that 5-year-old children should be emancipated from their parents, nor do we think that they have a right to an independent, self-planned life, or other rights associated with that, such as the right to sexual consent, the right to decide on one's own medical treatment, and so on. Nor does Wise actually maintain that autonomy rights do entitle apes to life without some type of supervision or guardianship. He reassures the courts that he's seeking only to have the badly treated chimps treated somewhat better, transferred to a different supervised setting, and not to have them utterly freed. It's never made clear why he does think that confinement and guardianship are good for apes, and he presumably does not think that human guardianship is good for whales and elephants, although he says nothing about that. So the concept of autonomy and its implications for animal lives remain unclear. But by showing how like us animals are, Wise hopes to demonstrate, he says in the film, that the line typically drawn in law between humans and other animals is irrational and needs rethinking. If we think, he says, that children deserve some rights, albeit with qualifications and limitations, we should grant that these species of animals also have rights. It's irrational and inconsistent to treat all human beings as persons and to treat all animals as mere property. At this point, Wise uses an analogy to slavery. Just, he says, just as law used to treat slaves as mere property, and we have now seen that this was morally heinous, so too, he says, we should realize that our current treatment of animals is morally heinous. Now, in the film, the slavery analogy immediately gets strong pushback from some of Wise's interlocutors, because it's being read as suggesting, totally inappropriately, that African Americans are very like chimpanzees. So that's not the point he means to convey. So he backs off of that analogy, but he does not back away from the idea that we must make a transition in law from thinking of animals as mere property to seeing them as persons. He repeatedly points out that, after all, corporations are given rights under law as persons, so the extension of rights to self-directing animals is surely an easier transition than that. Throughout the book and film, Wise presents lots of evidence that his core species of animals have human-like abilities of many types. His central rhetorical strategy in the film is to show chimpanzees and other apes doing things that the viewer will immediately recognize as human-like, using sign language, giving displays of empathy when shown a movie of humans in an emotional situation, and so on. Now, the idea that some animals are surprisingly like humans and that this has implications for ethics, is not new. In 55 BC, the Roman leader Pompey staged a combat in the gladiatorial arena between humans and elephants. Surrounded in the arena, the animals perceived that they had no hope of escape. According to Pliny, they then, quote, entreated the crowd, trying to win their compassion with indescribable gestures, bewailing their plight with a sort of lamentation, end quote. And then he says that the audience, moved to pity and protest, rose to curse Pompey, feeling, writes Cicero, who describes the same incident, that the elephants had a relation of commonality, of societas, with the human race. And not all religions and worldviews have actually held that humans are a superior species. Buddhism and Hinduism have a far more generous view of the world of nature. As Anglo-Indian philosopher Richard Sorabji shows, even in the Western tradition, the humans on top view was not held by most ancient Greco-Roman schools of philosophy, most of whom refused to draw a sharp line between humans and other animals, and some of whom strictly prohibited meat-eating and all infliction of pain on animals. But the Greek and Roman Stoics, enormously influential both in antiquity and in the development of Christian ethics, did hold that non-human animals were mere brutes, totally lacking in thought or emotion, while humans are quasi-divine and able to share in Zeus's rational plan for the universe. So on that account, they say, we can use non-human animals any way we want. Stoicism influenced Christianity, and so too did Judaism, which similarly held that the human being is special. Made in the image of God, the human is the only truly intelligent and spiritual being, the only one to whom salvation is open. Now, Wise knows that his audience was formed in these traditions, and he makes the shrewd guess that if he is to move the needle on animal rights, he'll have to begin where the audience is. He calls this beginning the first salvo in a strategic war, and also kicking the first door open. So he clearly isn't indifferent to a wider project of winning rights for all animals, and his close and determined attention to the capacities and deprivations of some species is surely commendable. Nonetheless, one might have worries. The choice of a theoretical framework influences where we'll be able to go. It's important to get the theory right for reasons of truth and understanding, and it's also important to get a strategy that starts us in the right direction rather than pointing us down a blind alley. So what then might be some problems with Wise's strategy from the philosophical viewpoint? Most obviously, it validates and plays upon the familiar old idea of a scala naturae, a ladder of nature, with humans at the top. Some animals get in, but only because they're so much like us. So the first door is open, but then it's slammed shut behind this group, and no one else gets in. So instead of the old line, we have a slightly different line, but it's not really all that different. Most of the animal world still lies outside in the dark domain of mere thinghood. The idea of the ladder of nature is essentially a religious idea, whether in its Stoic form, where only humans partake in Zeus's plan for the universe, or in its Judeo-Christian form, where humans are made in the image of God. It derives from anthropocentric views of these religions, according to which God, imagined as rather like us, only better, using speech, reasoning, and language, makes us special, like God, and then values us because we are God-like. The idea of superiority is not drawn from looking at nature, and it doesn't correspond to what we see when we look at nature. If we can put aside our arrogance, what we see are thousands of different animal life forms, all exhibiting a kind of ordered striving. Life forms aim at survival, flourishing, and reproduction in marvelously different ways. They don't line up to be graded on a single scale. They're just amazingly different. If we want to play the rating game, let's play it fairly. We humans win the prize on the IQ test, and guess who invented that test? But many animals are much stronger and swifter. Birds do vastly better on spatial perception and the ability to remember distant destinations. Most animals have a much keener sense of smell. Our hearing is very limited. Some animals, for example dogs, hear higher frequencies than we do, and other animals, such as elephants, hear and make much lower frequencies than we do. Some animals have sensory capacities that humans lack completely. Many birds navigate through a kind of sensory awareness of magnetic fields. Dolphins are able to perceive both the surface and the insides of an object through a capacity called echolocation. That's one very remarkable example was that a dolphin understood that the trainer was pregnant before she herself knew that, because it could echolocate the insides of her body. So anyway, that's a remarkable capacity. We sing opera, birds sing amazing bird song, whales sing whale songs of remarkable versatility. Is one of these better? Well, to a lover of music, that's sort of like asking whether we should prefer Handel or Duke Ellington. They're so different that it just is not a sensible question to kind of grade them on a single scale. As for the life-sustaining abilities, rats are far more successful reproducers and survivors. Numerous animals, from tube worms to bowhead whales, have greater individual longevity. Shall we ask about moral abilities? Well, we pride ourselves there, but we humans engage in depths of deliberate cruelty and torture known to no other animal species. No other species makes systematic war against its own kind. Do we think that we're the most beautiful? Well, usually we do. Jonathan Swift, however, was persuasive when he depicted Gulliver after years living with the lovely horse-like Houyhnhnms, finding the human shape and smell disgusting. No other animal has such arrogance about its beauty, but also no other animal so hates and flees from its own embodiment. In short, if we are to line up the abilities fairly, not prejudging things in favor of the things that we happen to be good at, many animals win many different ratings games. But by this time, the whole idea of the ratings game may begin to seem a bit artificial. What seems really interesting is to study the sheer differentness and distinctiveness of each form of life. Rather than unsettling our thinking in a way that might truly lead to a revolutionary embrace of animal lives, Wise just keeps the same old thinking and the old line and just shifts several species to the other side. The Scala Naturae is not just intellectually lazy and complacent, it is also, I would claim, dangerous. It discourages useful self-criticism. It leads to ugly projects in which humans imagine transcending our merely animal bodies by casting aspersions on the smells and fluids of the body. These projects, and I've studied this in a lot of my work, are so often accompanied by attempts to subordinate some other group of human beings on the grounds that they are the true animals. Bad smell, contaminating physicality, hypersexuality are imputed to some relatively powerless group of humans as an excuse for violent types of subordination. One may trace these ideas in US racism, in the Indian caste hierarchy, in misogyny all over the world, in homophobia. And actually our law school has had a comparative project through the center in Delhi to study these forms of disgust in concert with scholars in India. So it's an ongoing comparative project. Wise's strategy does nothing to undermine these baneful human practices. Indeed, it just reinforces them with its line drawing. Wise's approach, furthermore, cuts most of the animal kingdom adrift with nothing to gain from his interventions. He clearly doesn't like this result, but it's hard to know what his theory yields for the terrible sufferings of pigs and chickens, for the loss of habitat by polar bears and dozens of other wild animals. Or rather, it's not hard to see what he offers. He offers nothing. A wholly new approach would need to be invented once we would move outside the special sphere of the species who are like us. He gives us no idea what that new approach would be. And what's totally lacking is wonder at the diversity of nature, love of its many distinctive forms of life. There's a further disturbing consequence of the so like us approach. It leads to a focus on artificial performances that are not really characteristic of the species as it lives its life in the wild. Thus, Unlocking the Cage spends a lot of time on apes using sign language. And it is indeed true and impressive that chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas can learn sign language. But they don't use it when they're not living among humans in a research setting. Indeed, although dolphins actually do sometimes carry human-learned behavior with them back into the wild and teach it to their young, I'm not aware of any case in which apes have done that with sign language. It just isn't useful to them. They have other ways of communicating. And although Wise might have demonstrated the empathy and emotion of apes and elephants in many ways, as primatologist Frans de Waal has been doing for years, he instead dwells in the film on an example of empathy that is conveyed to the animal through a TV portrayal of a human situation, and that then the animal's response is conveyed to the researchers through sign language. So a gorilla watches a movie in which a human child is saying goodbye to its family, and the gorilla makes the signs for sad and so on. Again, using sign language to indicate emotion is something that apes do to and for humans, not something they do among themselves. Although among themselves they have, as de Waal has shown in many books, plenty of ways of communicating emotion. Wise presumably likes the sign language empathy example because it helps him establish likeness to us. But it is a pet trick. It becomes very hard, in fact, to understand the rationale by which Wise condemns some learned ape tricks, such as the ape doing karate kicks, and yet loves and foregrounds the language tricks. Both are very similar, it seems to me, assuming that the karate kick was taught through positive reinforcement and not by cruelty. Parlor tricks that show us something about the animal, but not something that lies at the heart of its own form of life. Whether it's ethical to teach such tricks can surely be debated, and I'm sure that Wise would defend the sign language trick for what it teaches us. But that's just it, what it teaches us, not what it does for and in the animal life. Wise argues that we need to begin by focusing on only a few rights for a few animals, because people will be terrified if the door is opened to all sorts of rights for all sorts of animals. Will my dog be able to sue me? Must I immediately stop eating meat? And so on. But that all depends on what's being asked and argued. Sure, if someone immediately said all animals should be given the right to vote, people wouldn't even understand the proposal. But Wise's approach also has to exercise caution. If he were asking that all apes be immediately allowed to roam around with no guardianship or supervision, the judges wouldn't like that either. So he insists that that's not what he's asking, a concession that actually complicates his demand for habeas corpus for these chimpanzees. But a proposal that asks for a species-specific level of ethical consideration for a wide range of creatures need not be impossibly utopian. People appreciate consistency and theoretical integrity. Sooner or later, they're going to wake up to the fact that Wise is playing bait and switch. Likeness to humans for some creatures, some other as yet unannounced rationale for all other creatures. It is then with a certain relief that we turn, or I should say return really, to the theoretical approach to animal entitlements that has long led the way in the Western tradition since the end of the 18th century, although it also harks back to much earlier approaches, namely the utilitarian approach pioneered by utilitarianism's founder Jeremy Bentham and known today in the important work of Peter Singer. Now, I've talked about utilitarianism and its good and bad points constantly in a lot of publications, so I'm going to treat this rather briefly here. Bentham famously held that the salient ethical facts, and indeed the only salient ethical facts, are pleasure and pain. He strongly insisted that pleasures and pains do not vary along any qualitative dimension, only along several dimensions of quantity, of which duration and intensity are the most important. The goal of each individual sentient being is and ought to be, says he, the maximization of net pleasure. The goal of a rational society is and ought to be the maximization of net pleasure for all of society's members. It's at this point, in a famous footnote, that Bentham points out that given the salience of pleasure and pain, there's no reason at all to exclude non-human animals from the utilitarian calculus. The footnote concludes, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Bentham was keenly aware of animal suffering and developed strong arguments against hunting and fishing for sport, as well as other cruel practices. And Peter Singer really is the heir to that idea. What's undoubtedly valuable about the Benthamite approach is its emphasis on the terrible cruelty of lots of human behavior to animals and the pain that it inflicts. Pointing to the commonality between humans and animals in respect of suffering, moreover, is to point to something clearly relevant to the animals themselves and a salient fact in their lives. Chimpanzees can learn sign language, but they don't really care very much about it. All animals care a lot about pain. They flee it, and they give lots of evidence of plotting their lives so as to avoid it. Moreover, now that more of Bentham's work is being published really quite recently and available to us, we're able to see that Bentham was undertaking what Stephen Wise definitely does not undertake, and what I suggested we must undertake, a radical assault on the human-animal divide in Christian ethics and its ranking of lives and abilities. Its puritanism about bodily pleasure, its relative indifference to bodily pain, especially in a radical work unpublished in his lifetime, actually published in 2012, called Not Paul, But Jesus. Bentham's insistence that pleasures differ only in quantity can be seen clearly as a radical assault on Victorian ideas of higher and lower pleasures, aimed at establishing the value, in his own approach, that is aimed at establishing the value of non-marital and unconventional sexual relations, and particularly aimed at decriminalizing same-sex activities. So Bentham is not being obtuse when he says all pleasures are similar. He's actually trying to be radical, and his radicalism leads him to an embrace of the body that offers a very good basis for a restored attitude to all animals. Still, there remain some important problems with Bentham's approach. The first and most obvious is its account of the social goal, which is maximization of net pleasure. Bentham tells us little about how we should aggregate pleasures across creatures, and little about how quantities would be assigned to pleasure and pain, but on any plausible reading, the calculus produces an aggregate figure, whether a total or an average, and it has no account of the permissible floor. Bentham was averse to the idea of rights, and that means that he offers us no account of a bare minimum beneath which a creature should not be permitted to fall. Everything depends on uncertain empirical calculations, on the average conception, according to which we're supposed to maximize average utility across all creatures, understood as pleasure. Egregious harms to animals will still be allowed on the view, so long as we can show that these harms raise the average pleasure in the world. It's far from clear that the calculus gives us reasons to stop humans from inflicting torture on animals, since humans often greatly enjoy these bad practices. The argument that this torment is unjustified therefore rests on a fragile and uncertain foundation. On the total conception, according to which we're supposed to maximize total utility, things are even more problematic. For we can add to the world's total of pleasure by deliberately bringing into the world thousands and millions of creatures of whatever species whose lives are extremely miserable so long as those lives exhibit a slim net balance of pleasure over pain. Meat eating results in the deliberate creation of millions of animals who would never have existed otherwise, and thus it could end up looking like a good thing under utilitarianism, depending how we measure pleasures and pains and so forth. In general, Bentham supplies no account of urgent entitlements grounded in justice, and we badly need such an account. A second problem lies in Bentham's determination to reduce quantity to quality, and this was already quality to quantity, sorry. This was already seen by John Stuart Mill, his student. We get a very narrow account of what is important in animal, including human animal, lives, just pleasure and the avoidance of pain, and he insists that all pleasure is qualitatively similar. Thus, there's no room for the special value of free movement, of companionship and friendly relations with other members of one's own kind, of the need for sensory stimulation, of a pleasing and suitable habitat. In this failing, Benthamism converges with Wise's approach. Both fail to consider and positively value the many complex forms of life that animals actually lead. Pleasure and pain simply are not the only relevant issues when evaluating an animal's chances to flourish. This problem would be less grave if deprivation of some aspect of its natural form of life always produced a commensurate pain. Then Bentham might be able to get to the correct conclusion, albeit by a defective route. But it's long been argued that this is not the case for human beings. The familiar economic concept of what are called adaptive preferences refers to the fact that humans who are deprived in some area often tailor their preferences and satisfactions to the reduced way of life that they have known, probably in order to avoid pointless longing and striving. Thus, for example, women who are brought up to think that a good woman doesn't go on to higher education or doesn't participate in politics will often not feel pain at the absence of those things. It takes a consciousness-raising movement to get her to see what she's missing and why it's important for her. Unfortunately, the same is very likely true for many non-human animals. An animal raised in captivity can't really form an imaginative picture of a wild habitat. and thus it can't yearn or long for it, be pained because it doesn't have it. Nor can an animal cut off from characteristic social interactions with other members of its kind, for example, in a zoo setting. Imagine what those interactions are like, or grieve at their absence. Ironically, then, if humans do only a little depriving, the animal may be able to feel pain about it, and that pain will register in the utilitarian calculus. But if humans deprive the animal in deeper and more fundamental ways, they may not even get to the point of missing what they have never known, and that pain, therefore, will not count in the utilitarian calculus. And finally, Bentham seems to think that all pleasure is a feeling. That feeling is typically produced by an activity. So the pleasure of eating is produced by eating, the pleasures of friendship produced by interacting with your friends. But of course, it might have been produced in some other way. Philosopher Robert Nozick imagined what he called an experience machine. So hooked up to the experience machine, you would have the impression that you were eating, talking to your friends, and so on, and you would have the pleasure associated with those pursuits. But you would not really be doing anything at all, and there would be no friends actually there. Nozick bet that most people would reject the experience machine, and over time he's proven quite correct. Being the author of their own actions is important to people, not just the feelings they have. But surely the same is true of non-human animals. Most animals love doing things and being active. Being the author of their own behavior matters greatly to them. So the utilitarian approach has no way of accounting for that idea. Utilitarianism, then, has great advantages, but also great problems. Both of the approaches I've considered have, you can now see, a common problem. They reduce the complexity of animal lives to an unhelpful simplicity. Wise, as it were, levels up, reason is the thing, and look how many creatures have it. Singer and the utilitarians level down, pain is the thing, and all creatures have it and have it alike. But what we surely need is the complexity of the world we live in, an approach that looks at whole animal lives without a single linear reduction, one that focuses on the evil of pain, sure, but also on the capacity of animals for many types of fascinating activity, the need of all animals for full and flourishing and often communal lives. The capabilities approach, which I'll call CA after this, was developed initially by economist Amartya Sen and then by me, with only the human case in mind. But it was developed, at least by me, with insights coming from Aristotle, who advocated that we should seek what is common to all animals and seek what he called a common explanation for the self-maintaining and self-reproducing striving that characterizes all animal lives. So it's not surprising that it proved easy for me, and that actually was what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on back in 1975, to extend it to the lives of non-human animals. The CA argues that the right thing to focus on when asking how well a group of humans or a nation is doing is to look not at average utility, and also not simply at opulence, GDP per capita, but rather at what people are actually able to do and to be. The best approach, we argue, focuses on people's substantial freedoms to choose things that they have reason to value. The right question to ask then is, what are you actually able to do and be in areas of importance in your life? And the answer to that question is the account of that person's capabilities. Now, I've distinguished three different types of capabilities First, there are what I call basic capabilities, that is the innate equipment of a being that enables it to develop further. Second are what I'll call internal capabilities, abilities of a person developed through care and nurture. Well, so developing internal capabilities already requires social support, but a person might get these inside, so to speak, and still not be fully capable of choice and action. Such a person might, for example, be capable of political speech, but not be permitted by her nation to exercise that speech politically. So I argue that the most important type of capability for a decent society is what I call combined capabilities, that is, internal capabilities plus external social and political conditions that make choice really available. Now, thus far, capabilities specify a space of comparison, and that's the main use of the approach in my collaborator Amartya Sen's work, as also in the human development reports of the UN Development Program, which he helped to found. But in keeping with my interest in theories of basic justice and constitution making, I have gone further, using the idea of capabilities to describe a partial approach to minimal justice. For that purpose, of course, we have to get definite about content, as users of the approach comparatively do already in their choice of examples. I've proposed a list of 10 capabilities that must be secured up to a minimal threshold level if a nation is to have any claim to justice. This list, humble and revisable, is supposed to be an abstract template that can be further specified in accordance with a particular nation's history and material circumstances. Now let's turn to animals, and if you look at the list, you'll see that number 8 already includes relationships with other species and the world of nature as a central political goal. But for me, that's just not enough. I've also urged adopting a similar list of capabilities as ethical goals for all animals, focusing on now the large rubrics of the list, which I think capture a kind of shared terrain of our animality. In the human case, I justify the list by arguing that these opportunities are inherent in the notion of a life worthy of human dignity. But now I argue that dignity belongs to other animals as well. All are worthy of lives commensurate with the many types of dignity inherent in their many forms of life. All animals, in short, should have a shot at flourishing and living with dignity in their own way. Now, still looking at the list, in some concrete ways, the human list is a bad fit. Freedom of the press and employment opportunities have a place in human lives that they don't have in other animal lives. But if we just focus on the big general categories, I think the list is a good guide, which can then be specified further for each animal after a study of its form of life. If the human list is a template for constitution making, as it is for me, so too is the list for each animal species, a written basis for what has to be, in our world, a virtual, unwritten constitution for that species. It tells us the right things to look for and strive for, the right questions to ask. So very generally, all animals deserve sensitive ethical consideration, meaning ethically informed concern for the types of lives they're actually trying to lead. The list then directs our attention to a host of pertinent other factors. What lifespan is normal for that species in the wild? What is the physical condition of a healthy animal? What human acts invade or impair the bodily integrity of that type of animal? What types of movement from place to place are normal and pleasurable for that type of animal? What type of sensory and imaginative stimulation does this animal seek? And what is it to keep that animal in an unacceptably deficient sensory environment? What is it for that sort of animal to live in crippling and intolerable fear and depression, or with a lack of bonds of concern? What types of affiliations does this animal seek in the wild? What kind of groups, both reproductive and social, does it enjoy? What types of communication does the animal engage in, using what sensory modalities? What is it for the animal to be humiliated and not respected? What is it for the animal to play and enjoy itself? And that's a very important thing that's the subject of a lot of new research, because animals play, they have jokes, they have humor, and so on. Does the animal have meaningful relationships with other species? And finally, what types of objects and environments does this animal need to control if it is to live its life? My capability number 6, practical reason, seems to pertain more to some animals than others, in that some engage in much more complicated strategies and plans. Probably that's what wise means by autonomy. But actually, all animals direct their own life course by their own powers of perception and thought, whatever those are. Again, political participation seems not really relevant in non-human animals, but think again. Of course it's pertinent for them, just as it is for us, because it's through politics in this world that we're in that the conditions of life are agreed to, and someone who has no political standing has no voice in choices that govern his or her own life. So too for animals. If they have no legal standing, no legal status that guarantees ethical consideration, then they're at the mercy of luck. They have no voice in what happens to them. Now, Wise rightly notes that human beings with profound cognitive and social disabilities have been granted legal standing, although everyone knows that they have to exercise it through a surrogate. So it's clear that political participation can pertain to a creature, even when its exercise must take place through forms of advocacy or surrogacy. Each creature, then, deserves ethical consideration for what it is, and a kind of virtual constitution that specifies what harms it should not be permitted to suffer, not in terms of its likeness to humans or its possession of some least common denominator property, but in terms of what it is itself, the form of life it leads. What might this mean for law? Well, there's so many things, but I'll just give you one example that can help carry our thinking further. For there's a happy harbinger of what may be a new era in law in the form of a remarkable 2016 opinion by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in a case called Natural Resources Defense Council Incorporated versus Pritzker. That's Penny Pritzker, the Commerce Secretary at the time. The Ninth Circuit ruled that the U.S. Navy violated the law in seeking to continue a sonar program that impacted the behavior of whales. To some extent, the opinion is a technical exercise in statutory interpretation of a federal law called the Marine Mammals Protection Act. The court says that the fact that the program has, quote, negligible impact on marine mammals does not exempt it from a separate statutory requirement, namely that it must establish means of, quote, affecting the least practicable adverse impact on, end quote, marine mammal species. What's significant and fascinating is that the argument relies heavily on a consideration of whale capabilities and form of life that the program disrupts. And I should mention that it was written by a judge who resides in Seattle, and where whale watching is a very favorite hobby of many people, and I think this is not an accident. So the opinion goes Effects from exposures below 180 decibels can cause short-term disruption or abandonment of natural behavior patterns. These behavioral disruptions can cause affected marine mammals to stop communicating with each other, to flee an insonified area, to cease foraging for food, to separate from their calves, and to interrupt mating. LFA sonar can also cause heightened stress responses from marine mammals. Such behavioral disruptions can force marine mammals to make trade-offs like delaying migration, delaying reproduction, reducing growth, or migrating with reduced energy reserves. So that's the end of the quote. The opinion does not give whales legal standing. No such radical move is needed to reach the clear conclusion that the sonar program is illegal and unacceptable, but it does recognize whales as beings with complex and active lives that include emotional well-being, affiliation, and free movement. In short, a variety of species-specific forms of agency. The opinion goes well beyond Bentham, and it also eschews the anthropocentric approach of Stephen Wise. It's a harbinger, I hope, of a new era in the law of animal welfare. This talk has argued that the capabilities approach is equipped to provide an approach to animal lives superior to that offered by the other two approaches in politics and law. But the approach is just that, an approach, so it's just the beginning. It needs to be further refined, and really this is what my book is trying to do, and it needs to confront some very difficult questions. In this concluding section, I discuss very briefly just 3 of them, each of which would be a chapter in the book, in a way, therefore, that's intended to be just a sketch. First, shouldn't humans still come first? So, the CA was inspired in the first instance by the urgent needs and sufferings of human beings. In a world where there's so much hunger and desperate need, it can seem, and I think it does seem, inappropriate or even frivolous to many sensitive people to even consider the needs of animals unless one were to state unequivocally that humans come first. I've already given reasons for doubting the usual rationales offered for human superiority, but there remains the practical attachment we all have to our own species, the sense that it makes a huge difference whether the life saved is that of a human child or a kitten. Different people have very different intuitive responses to this question, and that itself ought to lead us to pause and deliberate, to educate ourselves about animal lives, and to hesitate before just asserting that human beings deserve priority. But I think we can go further. Our world is a shared world. Many creatures use this planet. We all find ourselves, as it were, thrown into this place, and the species have complex interconnections too. Some views teach us that we are the masters of the world and other creatures just our servants, but there are other images available as well as in the lives of people who live close to animals, namely the image of a multi-species world in which we can, and I believe should, cultivate far more reciprocity and mutual awareness. And we can go even further. An attunement to the lives of other animals and a sense of wonder at their complexity and dignity is a part of our humanity, which we blunt at our peril. Young children typically respond very keenly to animal lives and animal deaths. Indeed, they often imagine their own emotions and perceptions through the stories of animals that they see and hear. The sharp separation of the human is not necessary or natural. It is cultural, and it begins quite late in life. We can enrich our human capabilities by keeping alive and further cultivating that sense of wonder and attunement. Now, this approach I've sketched so far is a direction, not a destination. It does not yet tell us how to address particular instances of conflict, but it tells us how to cultivate a humanity that can see conflict as conflict. There are, and will continue to be, many instances of human-animal conflict. Ethical attunement means that we will not simply shrug our shoulders and go on. Instead, we will come to see many of these conflicts as genuinely tragic, meaning that there's no choice available that's fully ethical in the largest ethical sense. When we see such tragic conflicts, as I've said, actually following Hegel, these should move us to search for a future that would not confront our choices with such dire options. For example, members of indigenous communities who have had rituals involving hunting of animals have now proposed adjusting those rituals into a new one where the hunting is merely symbolic. And I like that because Greek tragedy probably originated as a symbolic displacement of actual human sacrifice. So we could go further. We could imagine substitutes for animal research, which actually already exist through computer simulation, and substitutes which again already exist for fur, leather, and even meat. Pursuing the latter has large dividends for climate change, since meat eating is a large cause of global warming. But if we don't even think about the ethics of animal lives, we won't push our imaginations to develop these alternatives further. Second, the limits of human intervention. I've just spoken of a kind of massive human intervention into animal lives, and I've spoken of it as something to be approached with delicacy and caution, but I'm not in principle opposed to intervention. However, shouldn't humans try, insofar as we can, not to interfere at all in the lives of wild animals? Dogs, cats, and most species of horses have evolved as symbiotic domesticated creatures, but that's just not true of most animals, so shouldn't we just try to keep our hands off? Now, the minute we start talking about protecting their habitats, however, we're talking already of intervention, of responsible stewardship of wild places. Humans dominate everywhere. So if there was once a sense of the wild, it isn't there any longer. The lands, the seas where whales are choking on plastic, and even, of course, the air. Even after we prevent humans from polluting and deforesting large tracts of land where animals live, we actually need to intervene in other ways if they're really to be capable of living well. Large wildlife reserves in Africa typically spray for tsetse flies, monitor the area for fire and water damage, intervene in times of drought, and of course, try very, very hard to stop poaching. Well, there really isn't a hands-off option, I think, in today's world. There are only different types of human stewardship, and we need to discuss the ethics of this stewardship. Finally, third, why should we limit our ethical concern to animals? Since the capabilities approach, as I've discussed it here, focuses on species that have a form of life and some sort of complexly organized teleological life striving, why not include plants in our concern? Naturally, both plants and other elements of the natural world, the winds, the rivers, the seas, have enormous instrumental importance for both humans and animal lives. Ecosystems also have immense instrumental importance. But should we also recognize these entities as among the intrinsic ultimate ends for which the capabilities approach seeks to provide a support structure? The answer to this question obviously makes a huge practical difference. It also makes a large theoretical difference, because granting intrinsic end status to ecosystems means jettisoning the principle that each individual being, and only individual beings, are to count as ends in themselves. Now, I've long defended that principle, pointing out that every group we know, families, tribes, nations, religions, contain hierarchy and subordination. And of course, all of them typically subordinate women, so that's an aside. But justice seems to require the dismantling of these hierarchies, and the best way to express our commitment to do that is to say that each individual person counts as an end and counts equally. That principle might possibly survive the move to include plants, though actually the whole notion of the individual in the case of plants is very, very unclear. Like, when does a plant get born? When does a plant die? And so on. It would not certainly survive the inclusion of ecosystems or non-living parts of nature. Well, maybe that's all we can say, but it would be nice if we could say more. At this level of depth, all of our ethical intuitions are very unclear and subject to great doubt. But one of my salient intuitions is that sentience, not just the ability to feel pain, but that's one important part of it, but having sense perception is an important boundary in the world of nature, a baseline requirement of ethical consideration as an end. The idea of injustice, for me, involves the idea of thwarting, and a being can be thwarted only if it is, as it were, moving toward something, striving for something, not just acting in a way to promote continued life, the way plants surely do. Aristotle found the dividing line in his notion of orexis, usually translated desire, but really meaning a kind of reaching out that in his view is always accompanied by sense perception. Now that leaves us with a gray area. There are what Aristotle called the stationary animals, such as sponges and anemones, and they're capable of maybe some rudimentary sense of touch, but they don't strive or move from place to place. So Aristotle actually doesn't think that they have orexis. In any case, what I think is that the ability to perceive an object of desire, to move toward it, and to feel pain at being thwarted with respect to it is all necessary for ethical standing. Pain is, as it were, the great evil. Not the only evil, but the great evil. And the painless deaths of plants seem to me not to involve injustice or wrong, though they may be unfortunate in other ways. I may be wrong about this, and we need a lot more debate. And in our Human Development and Capability Association, we are constantly having this debate. But for now, that's the reason why I don't extend my theory to plants. Utilitarian theories are not right about everything, but they see one large thing very clearly. There are many other thorny problems, and I'm grappling with them now as I write the chapters of my large book. I've never had such an exhilarating intellectual and emotional journey. But it's time now for us to acknowledge, we in the humanities and we who love the humanities, that we share this world of ours with other creatures, and that what they're able to do and to be matters greatly. I claim that the capabilities approach is the most promising theoretical framework as we pursue this deeply urgent task of ethical awakening. So thank you very, very much. It's been an honor to give this talk.